This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
Welcome to The Call Sheet, the podcast that goes behind the scenes of the Australian entertainment industry, meeting the creative minds giving shape to our culture. I'm Bryce Corbett.
Marker.
Welcome to the first episode of The Call Sheet. Long-time listeners of News Club will be familiar with my colleague Kate Watson's excellent series of interviews with the people who inform and influence Australians when it comes to the news. But with this short series, we want to pull back the curtain on the Aussie entertainment industry. The producers, the writers, the streamers and the theatre types. And to ease the transition, we're starting with the celebrated journalist Peter Greste, who has a foot in both the newsmaker and the entertainment camps. You might have heard of Peter. He's the reporter who found himself the subject of the story when he was arrested and sentenced to 7 years in jail in Egypt during the political uprising that gripped the region in 2013. Why are we talking to Peter on a podcast about entertainment? Well, a new movie about his ordeal, The Correspondent, based on his book of the same name and starring Richard Roxburgh, is in cinemas now. And it's a compelling couple of hours of homegrown cinema. So I had questions about his backstory and that extraordinary chapter of his life. But I also wanted to know about his experience of turning that story into a book firstly and then a movie, and what it's been like to unpack his trauma and share it so publicly with the world. And why are we interested in this for News Club? Well, we know that, like us, you get your sense of what's happening in the world from many sources, and those sources include the world of entertainment. So, we're peeking behind the curtain so you learn a little bit more about the how and the why of our cultural touchstones. This is The Call Sheet. So Peter, thank you for joining us, and can you perhaps start by telling us, first of all, how you came to be in Egypt in December 2013 and what the circumstances were leading to your sudden imprisonment there?
Yeah, sure. So I was working as a foreign correspondent for Al Jazeera at the time. I was based out of Nairobi covering East Africa. But Al Jazeera had a bit of a hole in its bureau coverage up in Cairo over the Christmas New Year period from 2013 into 2014. And I was a mug that didn't have much on myself then. And so I got a call saying, listen, do you mind coming up to Cairo to cover the bureau? Well, we've got that gap. I went up. There was an ongoing political crisis in Cairo at the time, across Egypt, in fact. The Muslim Brotherhood had formed the first democratically elected government in the country's history. That was back in the middle of 2012. But they really weren't a very good government. And by the middle of 2013, there were a lot of street protests. And so the military stepped in and said, listen, we're a democracy, you've lost the confidence of the people, it's time that you left, you've got to quit, and here's a gun to your head to make sure that you do that. In other words, it was a coup.
So you arrived in Cairo and thought, well, this will just be for 3 weeks and then I head back to Nairobi. But as it turned out, 400 days later, having spent 400 days in an Egyptian prison, wasn't quite what you were bargaining for.
No. I've been detained before. It's a bit of an occupational hazard when you're working, when you're jabbing governments in the eye across some fairly dodgy parts of the world. But this wasn't that kind of work. We were doing what I'd consider to be pretty vanilla journalism, journalism 101.
Yeah.
And so I really had no idea that we were about to be detained when we finally got that knock on the door.
And at which point did it dawn on you that this was going to be perhaps a little bit more serious than other episodes you'd had with authorities around the world?
Oh, gosh. I guess there were two kind of key moments where I realised that things were a bit more serious. The first was when I was placed in a detention cell, quite soon, a couple of days after I was picked up, in which it was about, I guess, 8 foot square, 2 metres square. But in that tiny concrete box, there were 16 guys. And some of them had been in there for the better part of 6 months. And I realised that this wasn't part of the kind of routine arrest and a bit of finger wagging followed by a release. And then we were taken for interrogation with the National Intelligence Directorate. And these guys are pretty serious. They're the interior police, the sort of secret police. And fairly early on, I learned the charges. We were being accused of aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, being members of a terrorist organisation, financing terrorism, broadcasting false news with intent to undermine national security. When you think about it, those charges were about as serious as you could get, short of actually pulling the pin on a grenade and rolling it into a crowded room.
And what's going through your mind when these charges are being read out to you?
Oh, I thought it was ridiculous. I mean, you know, the gap between the vanilla journalism that we'd actually been doing and those really serious terrorism charges was so wide that I couldn't comprehend how anybody could look at the work that we'd been doing and come to the conclusion that we'd actually been involved in terrorism. It just made no sense to me.
At which point did you think this ordeal is actually going to be a lot longer than I had perhaps anticipated?
This is going to sound a little bit ridiculous, but it probably took about 6 months when we were finally convicted. Because we thought, once we were arrested, I thought, look, once these guys look seriously at the evidence, they'll realise it's a non-starter and let us go. When the trial began, we thought the judge would take a quick look at the evidence and realise there's just no substance to us and just order the whole thing shut down. When we got to the end of the trial, we thought there was no way that they could possibly convict us. And if they were going to convict us, we thought, well, look, we've already spent 6 months in prison, so surely time served would be enough of a sentence and everyone's happy. We're allowed to go home. They get their conviction. You know, we can all claim some measure of victory and call it a day. But when we were convicted and sentenced to 7 years, that was a tough moment. That was a moment when I really had to think again.
So what are you thinking when you're being led back to your cell after being convicted or sentenced for 7 years?
My mind was spinning at that point. I mean, I was just so outraged. I was so outraged and upset. I couldn't believe that my life had been completely taken away like that, so arbitrarily, and with no sense of justice, no sense of remorse or regret, no twinge of guilt from the authorities that had put us behind bars. You know, it just seemed, I mean, it sounds naive to say it, to put it in those terms now, but I just couldn't, the lack of any kind of justice in that conviction was just mind-blowing to me. And I was completely outraged.
And you talk about, you know, you being in prison and being in a cell, but just try to explain perhaps what that cell was like, because certainly watching the movie, it didn't look like a very hospitable place to have to spend time.
I was in a period of solitary confinement for a couple of weeks. No reading material, no writing material, no access to anybody. You know, it's designed to mess with your head. It's designed to really grind you down psychologically.
And did it?
It started to. And there was an extraordinary guy called Allah Abdel Fattah who makes an appearance in the movie. He was one of Egypt's most charismatic, most intelligent political thinkers that I've ever come across. Not just Egypt, ever anywhere. And he'd been imprisoned for his pro-democracy activism by pretty much every regime in Egypt. So he understood very deeply how it works. And I remember a period when I was really struggling to understand what was going on. And I could feel myself disappearing down into this dark hole of depression, you know. And he first came past the outside of the cell where I was being held. He couldn't come in, and obviously the prisoners weren't allowed to communicate with us. But when the guards were sufficiently out of earshot, I could hear him whisper through the cell door, as much as you can whisper through steel, to tell me, it's okay, Mr. Peter, my name is Allah. The rest of, you know, you're in a political wing, you're with human rights activists, with poets and writers, with trade unionists, with judges and lawyers. It's okay, you're with friends. It meant that I understood at least a little bit about where I was and what was going on. And I remember speaking to him and saying, listen, I'm really struggling. My head is starting to go into a really dark place. And he said, listen, I don't know what's going on with your head, but you're not going to make it through here. You won't survive with your sanity intact unless you're able to make peace with your past. And I took that as a lesson really in surviving the prison system. So it was tough, but I realized that it wasn't about me. It was about what we'd come to represent. And I think that made a massive difference, seeing our imprisonment not as the consequence of anything we'd done personally, but as an attack on the institution of the press And so what we were doing was representing a fight against all journalists, not just a fight against ourselves. And in a funny way that might sound a little counterintuitive, that gave me the strength to pull through.
Remarkable. And I know you perhaps wouldn't describe The Correspondent, the film that's now in cinemas about this particular ordeal. You perhaps wouldn't describe it as entertaining per se, but it's a big budget Aussie film based on an experience that I think probably most people would understand if you would just prefer to forget. But what has it been like for you to see that story, your story, up on the big screen?
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating thing to watch and be a part of. The first thing to recognise is that it is my story, but it's not mine, and it's not me that's up on screen.
How do you mean?
Well, I wrote my memoir, The First Casualty, soon after I was released. That was published in 2017. That went to a screenwriter, Peter Duncan, who I spent a lot of hours talking with over his kitchen table. And Peter took my book and wrote the screenplay, gave his own sort of artistic interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Kriv Stenders, the director, then took the screenplay and reinterpreted it in the way that he wanted to make the film. The actors, people like Richard Roxburgh, who plays the lead role, and all of the other cast, took that direction and gave their own, sort of acting interpretation, as did the set designers and the director of photography and the editor and all of the people, all the wonderful creatives that were involved in the process. So what you end up seeing on screen is an artistic interpretation. I think Kriv put it wonderfully. He said that in making a film like this, it's not taking a photograph or creating a photograph. It's like creating a painting. It's that kind of artistic interpretation.
Yeah, I was interested to read in an op-ed that you wrote for the Herald and the Age that you watched it through your fingers. Why was that?
Yeah, because first of all, you're always sort of anxious about how you're going to be portrayed on screen.
Yeah.
All of what we've just been saying notwithstanding, there's a bloke up there with my name and going through my story and so on. And so it's hard to, it's sort of a bit nervy to see that. But also, even though I know the story, I've talked about it and written about it, I've even built a career on it. I thought I knew the edges of the story pretty well. But up on screen, these guys, the people involved with the movie, caught a lot of the essential emotional elements of the experience in ways that I hadn't anticipated. The kind of the confusion over our arrest, the sense of claustrophobia in the cells, the sheer Kafkaesque madness of the trial, the crazy kind of discombobulating moment of my release. All of that is really hardwired into the film, and that was challenging to watch. Also, and I think this is also really important, everybody focuses on the Egypt narrative. But you've seen the film. There is a parallel narrative.
Yeah.
The Egypt story ends well. Spoiler alert. The guy gets out.
He's out.
But that other story, the parallel narrative of my producer's experience, the tragic experience of my producer in Mogadishu, it is one that I hadn't really spoken about or engaged with anywhere near as much. And that was a much tougher watch because it doesn't end well.
We should explain. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about that? Because it's an important part of the film and it's a really effective device used in the film, I think. But I'm interested to hear you just say that it's not something you'd perhaps processed. This film would have forced you to do so. Can you just tell us exactly what happened?
Yeah, sure. So back in 2005, I was working with my producer, Kate Payton, in Somalia. We'd just gone to Mogadishu.
And you were with the BBC at that point?
I was working for the BBC at that point, yeah. And we went to Mogadishu to cover a whole series of stories related to the return of the government who'd been in exile in Nairobi for many years. And things had stabilised to the point where it looked as though the government could go back. And there was an advanced delegation of MPs that was in Mogadishu at the time trying to work out how to bring back the government and re-establish the bureaucracy and so on. And we weren't covering that particular part of the visit, but we were doing a whole bunch of stories about the kind of place that Somalia was at the time. And we'd we went to the hotel, we had a free afternoon, and we went to the hotel where the MPs were staying just to see if there was anyone worth talking to. The compound where we would have parked under normal circumstances inside the hotel grounds was completely full of government vehicles. So there was no space, and we thought, look, let's just park outside in the street. We'll duck in very quickly.
At this point, it's the three of you, isn't it? It's your driver, it's your producer, Katie, and yourself.
And myself, that's right. We ducked in, spent maybe 5-10 minutes in there. There wasn't anybody really worth talking to. It was a bit of a wasted trip. And so we came out, and as we came out, we were waiting for a few seconds for our driver to come and open up the car. There was a crack, a single shot, Kate was hit in the back. We rushed her to hospital. The hospital facilities in Mogadishu weren't great. The upside, I suppose, is that the surgeons had a lot of experience with these kinds of traumatic injuries. But unfortunately, they weren't able to save Kate. She died. That was a pretty difficult. That was easily the worst day of my life.
Leaving behind a fiancé and a young daughter.
Yeah, she had a fiancé. She had a daughter fiancé's daughter that she was in the process of adopting. So, for all sorts of reasons, it was a utterly pointless, brutal tragedy.
How do you then continue to do your job? How do you pick yourself up after an experience like that and go, this is what I want to continue to do?
So I felt quite bloody minded about it. And that's in fact why I also went back to Mogadishu about 5 years later for another film that I made for the BBC, for the Panorama program, which is the BBC's equivalent of Four Corners. Because, I really wrestled with it a lot, but I felt that Kate and I knew full well what we were doing. We were carrying battlefield body armour. We were carrying battlefield trauma pack, a first aid kit, which was almost as, had extraordinary first aid equipment, not a whole lot more than your average compression bandage and Band-Aids. This was a very serious trauma pack. And we were also working with 8 armed bodyguards. So we knew that this was a dangerous environment. And I felt that the people that murdered Kate were trying to stop us doing the work that we had set out to do. I felt that there is no way I'm going to let those assholes stop me from finishing the job. And that's, I'm not, in some ways I wish we'd done things differently, but looking back at the time, I can't see what decisions we might have made that could have avoided it, having all of the information that we'd had. There were a whole bunch of investigations. There was a BBC investigation, there was a British police inquiry, there was a coroner's inquest. And in each of those, we were completely exonerated. The story was justified. The actions, the preparation that we took was gold standard. And the decisions that we took along the way were all perfectly justifiable decisions. And that ultimately, I wasn't responsible for Kate's death. Kate wasn't responsible for her death. The only person who was the asshole who pulled the trigger. Mm. And so on that basis, I felt there is no way I'm going to let that asshole stop me from doing my job and covering the stories that we felt needed to be covered and that our audiences felt that our audiences should be seeing. So that's why I continued, and that's why I went back to make that Panorama film.
The portrayal, I guess, in the film is that you still nevertheless felt some sense of responsibility, at least partially.
Oh, you can't go through with that. And just again, to be clear to our listeners, I started to really wrestle with the guilt when I was in solitary confinement. That was part of that's one of the things about solitary, is that when you have nowhere else to go, where your head there's no stimulation, your head starts to replay the story of your life on the walls of the cell. And you bring up all sorts of past wrongs, of regrets, of things that you wish you'd done differently, of all sorts of things that you wanted to have a different outcome. And for obvious reasons, that was a biggie. Mm. And I felt that if I can't see anything that I've done in my reporting to justify being in prison, maybe this is the universe. maybe this is karma coming back at me. Maybe I'm being punished for my sins of the past, for bad choices and decisions that I'd made, whether it was in previous relationships or Kate's murder. Now, on reflection, it seems silly, but I tell you, at that point, those demons really started to come up and haunt me.
Just explain, because it's interesting, I think, for people to understand the process of having a book optioned. What does that mean?
So, yeah, it is really interesting because I got a call from Carmel Travers, who herself, the producer, who herself started out her career as a journalist. She was a foreign correspondent. She was the first female to run the Channel 10 newsroom.
Yeah. Legendary.
She is quite a legend, yeah.
Yeah.
And she called me up and said, listen, I've read your book. I'm really interested in turning it into a movie. And I kind of laughed and I dismissed it initially. I thought it'll be nice. It's a nice conversation. She invited me for a coffee. But
I'll get a free cappuccino out of it.
I'll get a cappuccino out of this. I didn't think it would go anywhere because, 90% of movie projects never actually get turned into something that makes it to the big screen.
Yeah.
They always die a death. There are thousands of ways that these things can disappear. But she sat me down, we had a conversation. It was pretty clear that she was serious about it. And then she introduced me to the screenwriter, Peter Duncan. And I thought, well, this is going to be fun. I'll have a couple of lunches now and maybe get a bit of pocket money from the option fee that they gave me. It wasn't, it wasn't, as I said, enough for
three cappuccinos.
But the thing started to take on a momentum and a life of its own.
Because you're so right. So many books are optioned, and then that's the last that you ever hear of them. They disappear in the quagmire of pre-production. But this one managed to find its way through.
And I think it was because everyone involved was really genuinely curious in creating a really compelling narrative.
Yeah.
I'm sure that happens a lot of the time, but there was a genuine interest in seeing what it was that drove the story, what are the issues that lay behind the story, and how can we translate this into something that actually works for the screen. Peter showed enormous curiosity, and then when Kriv Duncan came on board, who was also, I'm half Latvian, and it turns out that he's half Latvian. Kriv Stender's the director. In fact, Kriv's father knew my father. They were refugees together as kids.
It's wild.
And so there are all sorts of connections that
So explain that to me. So your father and Kriv's father both moved from Latvia to Australia.
They fled out after the Second World War as refugees. In fact, I remember...
Did they know one another?
They did. In fact, I remember telling my dad, this is after Kriv came on board, I was telling my dad about how we'd been struggling to find a director and we'd finally found one, and Dad immediately said, well, hang on a minute, my old friend
I know
Andy
someone.
Stender's, his kid, his son is in the movie business. He might be able to help.
And you're rolling your eyes going, all right, sure, Dad, as if you know a film director.
It's okay, Dad, it's under control.
That is wild. And did you have any say over the choice of actors, the casting, the choice of directors? Do you?
Kind of. So, I suppose I had the right of veto. If I'd really put my foot down and said, no way. I personally was hoping to see someone like Chris Hemsworth in the role. I thought,
you're only human, Peter.
Hysterical laughter wasn't the response I was looking for there.
That was empathetic laughter, trust me.
No, if I'd have put my foot down and said, no, that guy's completely wrong for the role, then I suppose they might have thought about it. We might have had some conversations, but it didn't really work quite like that. There were a lot of conversations around who might be interested, and there were a few overtures made. But when Richard Roxburgh's name came up, and it became pretty clear that actually he really was the right person.
Look, I might be unnecessarily putting air in your tyres, but there is a physical similarity. It's not the weirdest casting choice.
Thank you very much. I'll take that as a compliment.
It's certainly how it was intended. You talk about Peter Duncan, the screenwriter. Did you have much of a hand in the screenplay?
Yeah, so he and I worked a lot together. I didn't do any of the writing, but we spent hours and hours around his kitchen table just talking about the story and the ideas behind it, and the experience of it and so on. and picking through all sorts of bizarre, weird details that he was interested in. And I got to see every version of the script, and I was able to give lots of feedback on it and talk about whether the dialogue worked and whether the characters felt right, and or whether there were things that I didn't feel comfortable with, and things that I wanted to see in the script. And so it was still Peter's creative work, but I was very closely involved with it.
And as a professional wordsmith, who, as a journalist and a published author, what did you learn about the process of writing for screen?
What a wonderful question. I think I learned about the economy of storytelling. And this is something I guess I've often learned too as a journalist, that there's a tendency to try and pack too much into the yarns that you're trying to tell, and often less is more. And that was spectacularly true of this story. There was a lot of paring back of detail.
Obviously, in any movie adaptation of a real event, there will be some license taken in the retelling of the story. Was that the case with this one?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's no story that translates perfectly onto screen, and this is no different. But I was very keen for certain elements to be really built into the script, into the story. I wanted, for example, the differences of opinion between myself and Mohammed Fahmy to be expressed and articulated on screen.
Mohammed being the producer who was also incarcerated with you.
My news producer who I was working
with Al Jazeera,
that's right.
Yeah.
He and I had very, very different views about what was taking place, the reasons that we were in prison, and therefore the strategies that we should be adopting to get out. Now, I was really keen to make sure that his view was presented fairly and robustly on screen. I worked a lot with Peter on those forms of on those dialogues, on those conversations, on those arguments that we had, because it seemed to me to be really important. I wanted the characters of the jailers to be there on screen as three-dimensional characters, as human beings, rather than as one-dimensional villains in this. There were a few scenes. I was very careful. I was very keen for Kate's story to be treated with respect. And I think it was, and I don't think too many people that know what happened or know Kate as a person would see anything in there that felt untrue or wrong. And there were a couple of scenes that were created to make sure that we had some really crucial conversations that helped explain some of the narrative. Yeah. But I'd say that 90% of the story is actually true. Yeah. It's pretty much bang on.
Of course, the movie is based on your memoir, The First Casualty, which was republished or has been republished now as The Correspondent, available in all good bookstores. The subtitle of that is A Memoir from the Front Lines of the Global War on Journalism. Why characterise your experience as part of a global war on journalism?
Because I saw it and still see it literally as a war that spans the entire planet. And I realised that, in fact, what had happened was we'd been detained using the kind of narratives that really started after 9/11, when George W. Bush announced the war on terror. What that did was license governments the world over to use the narrative of terrorism and national security to come after uncomfortable journalism. The Committee to Protect Journalists now says that journalists globally are being imprisoned at record rates. We're seeing the numbers of journalists murdered also around the world for their work at record highs. When I first spoke to Carmel Travis about making this film, I said to her that we need to do this quickly because these ideas would date. I felt the further we moved away from 9/11, the more that the narratives around national security and terrorism and so on would start to fade and grow old, and journalism would recover its rightful place in democracies and so on. Now that really seems naive, but Egypt is obviously one of the biggest jailers of journalists, but so too is Russia and China, Iran. Israel is now one of the biggest jailers of journalists, the same number of journalists imprisoned at the last census as Iran. These are shocking numbers. The CPJ says between 2/3 and 3/4 of the journalists that are now behind bars are there on what they broadly describe as anti-state charges. So that's things like treason, sedition, terrorism, breaches of national security, which tells you an awful lot about the kind of rhetoric that governments are using to come after journalism.
Mm-hmm. And let's be frank as well, this is not a problem that is just reserved to places like Egypt.
Oh, no.
I mean, I've just returned from a Churchill Fellowship and in the US and met with lots of media literacy experts and lots of academics, and there's an enormous amount of concern over there about what's happening in the US with respect to the erosion of trust in journalism.
And a much more explicit attacks on journalism. I mean, the Trump administration has decided to ban Associated Press from covering White House press briefings. But also, and I have to point this out, even in Australia, we've got nothing to be proud of. Our record is also pretty grim. We're not locking up journalists. We're not seeing the same kind of levels of attacks on journalism. But Australia, in 2018, Australia sat at 18th position out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index. We've now slipped, last year we slipped to 39th position in the World Press Freedom Index. That is a pretty dramatic collapse over 6 years.
And what is that due to here in Australia? What do you put that down to?
There are two big reasons. The first is the concentration of media ownership, which makes it very difficult for journalists to operate freely. But the other, and this is the big one that most people don't appreciate, is a really serious erosion of the space that journalists are able to operate in because of the spread proliferation of national security laws, which expose journalists' own data to overbearing and intrusive investigation, often without a warrant, that criminalise a lot of what would have been previously considered as legitimate journalism, and that expose journalist sources to criminal prosecution. Australia is the only liberal democracy, the only one that does not have any constitutional protection for press freedom. Now, as I said, you don't necessarily see journalists being imprisoned, but we know from research that the University of Queensland has been doing that it is having a very serious chilling effect on both the journalists and their sources. We know that journalists and editors are closing down investigations because of the risks of litigation and the costs of defending those stories in court. And that cannot be good for our democracy.
What do we lose, and would be my final question, what do we lose as a society when we allow for there to be this sort of erosion of trust in journalism in the fourth estate?
We lose our ability to have meaningful public conversations. We lose our ability to have a common basis of information, of facts and information around what the issues are that we should be discussing and what the basic elements of those issues, the basic facts of those issues are. It took us enormously long. I think it's now fairly well established that climate change is a thing. It should never have taken us as long to get to that point. We've probably lost at least a decade and a half, perhaps 2 decades of action on climate because of the loss of public confidence, the loss of our inability to come to terms with what the debate actually is and then start talking about what we should do about it. I think a lot of the problems that we had around COVID are connected to that as well. I think journalists themselves are partly to blame. I think that the industry has lost its way in terms of ethics and standards. I think it's very difficult for the public to make the distinction between good, reliable, ethical, serious journalism online and stuff that looks like good, serious, ethical journalism but has none of the ethics and standards that underpin the stuff that we should be.
You're talking specifically about mis and disinformation?
Well, I'm talking, not there's heavily any journalist worth their salt works in line with a code of conduct, a set of ethics and standards. The problem is that the mechanisms for holding journalists accountable to those codes of conduct are either very opaque or hopelessly ineffective. And there's no way online of making the distinction between work that's produced by someone who is accountable to a code of conduct and others' work that is not. And so what we're proposing is a professional association, voluntary association for journalists to sign on to a code of conduct that allows them to badge their work with maybe a little kite mark or something similar online, that allows the public to make that the distinction between the work that's produced by people who have publicly signed on to a code of conduct. They can see what that code of conduct is. They know that journalist is producing work. They might disagree with some of what their reporting is, but they know at least the basics of it, the core methodology that lie behind that journalism is produced to a standard of ethics and a code of conduct. And that work therefore becomes more trustworthy than something else that they might see that doesn't have that badge. That won't solve the problem alone, but we think that it might go a long way towards helping things along.
Still fighting the good fight. Peter Greste, thank you very much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.